Alrighty, greetings, citations on my beloved airborne simians, my dear flying Mikey Constables, and what up to any of you sports fans? You know what I'm thinking right now. I am Giovanni Cerrucci. This is Resistance Rising. Those that know, let me call me Johnny. Those that fear and hate pretend I don't exist. Like pretty much all of alternative media, and not all of the so-called anti-vax crowd. I have my dearest friend with me today, Greg Wyatt. I connected with Greg. Wow. A while ago. If we consider the very first time we connected, I think we're talking years. We're talking years. Greg and I connected over the issue of vaccine injury with his astounding story that he has now made into an autobiography. And it has been my thrill and my pleasure, to collaborate with Greg. Unfortunately, his family history is filled with trauma, so that's not been very thrilling, but it's a very, very valuable story to be told. And the name of the book, is there an online, Greg, where I can pull this up and run it in the background? Greg Wyatt website, book release?
Well, my website, gregwyatt.com. Everything is there. It's a very comprehensive look at my life. And if someone was to go on my website, you could literally spend hours and hours and hours and hours to review what I've experienced, what I've went through, what I've documented.
There we go. There we go.
There's my babies.
All right. I personally am not a fan of cookie dialogues, so we'll just let everybody know. Here's Greg's website. And where are we here? Make sure we're running on the background. We are running the background. Good. Odyssey. Ashes to Armor. Basically, Greg Wyatt autobiography. Thank you for sharing it with me. It was an astounding read. And I was very surprised. I don't know that I was tracking the controversy of your birth. I don't know that I was tracking the controversy of your birth. It actually got you a guest appearance on the Joan Rivers show. The personal trauma intimately involved with state-sponsored surgery, state-enforced sterilization. That's crazy.
Yes, it is.
Greg, start all the way back with the revelation that your dad, Shorty, was not your dad, and he had gone through his own traumas. He was your dad, but not your biological father. How did you get aware of that? And what made you aware of that?
It was June 8th, 1983. It was my 28th birthday, and I was in a drug rehab in Boulder, Colorado. And it happened to be family week. And my mother came to visit me from Lincoln, Nebraska. I always knew there was something different in my family. My father, Shorty Wyatt, was about 5'1". He was built like a jockey. He was just an amazing guy, small in stature, muscular, thick, dark hair. And here I was, 6 foot tall, Nordic, blonde hair. It just didn't make sense. So my mom set me down, and there was 2 big orderlies that were sitting in there. because she didn't know how I'd react to it. She had an idea. I loved my mother. And she says, Greg, I've got to tell you something. And immediately, I said, I knew it. I'm adopted. I've known it all along, and you lied to me. Great way to start your birthday.
Ouch. Yeah, ouch.
And she says, no, Greg, I am your mother. I gave birth to you, but your father is not who you think he is. And for a moment, I felt like I was living in a third dimension between Disneyland and the Twilight Zone. Here I was in a drug rehab trying to get sober, and all of a sudden, one of the biggest traumas I ever experienced just rolled out in front of me. And she said, after I said, I knew it, I'm adopted, she says, no, you're not adopted. I gave birth to you. And it was like, how's that work? She said, you were created through artificial insemination. It was a lot. And I said immediately, I said, well, who is my father? And with tears in her eyes, she said, Greg, I'm sorry. You'll never be able to find out who it is because the records were destroyed and everybody was sworn to confidentiality. And that's all I had. That's all I had going. But I made a promise to myself that I would find out who that man was. And you have to remember, this was June 8th, 1983. The internet did not exist at all. So I went back to Denver, Colorado, and started going through library records to find out artificial insemination. I thought that's what they did with animals, to create a better stock. I had no idea they were doing it to human beings. And I looked it up and it said, see animal breeding. I thought, well, it's time for a beer. So I went down to the bar and I had to think about it, how I was going to approach this. And I want to point out, I wasn't a slam dunk alcoholic. I just have 3 or 4 beers every once in a while just to calm my nerves and try to, even smoke a joint. I smoked a lot of pot back then. I just needed some release. So it's the animal breeding. And that's when I found out about the word eugenics. And I also found a word that was expunged through the whole situation. It's called eutellogenesis. Very important word, very hard to find. Eutellogenesis is creating gifted human beings using artificial insemination. And I thought, oh my God, how deep is this going to go? And I had no idea. No idea. Long story short, so I decided the only person that knew my biological father,
Who
whose
was
name
a
was,
Dutch scientist, yes?
yeah, Wiebe Cronje. And I went to see my doctor, my mom's pediatrician. I called him up on the phone. I said, this is Greg Wyatt. I'm living in Denver, Colorado. And he says, Greg Wyatt, how are you? I was really surprised he knew me. He says, yes, I remember you and your mother and your father and your family. And I didn't want to spill the beans then, but I said, hey, I'm going to be in Lincoln. I live in Denver. I'd like to come back and, see you. It's been a long time. He said, absolutely. So I went back to Lincoln, knocked at his door, and his wife answered the door. She says, "Oh, Greg, you're Greg. I'm so happy you came. My husband's waiting for you." Dr. Thurstein. His wife was his assistant. Did everything like a nurse. And she takes me down this hallway and opens the door. And there's this frail 80-some-year-old man. And he said, "Greg, come closer." He said, "I'm sorry I'm like this. I'm dying of cancer." And he laughs. He says, "I guess we don't live forever." He said, "I'm so happy you came." Well, I had a lot of questions. And the first thing I asked him, I says, "Well, I'm aware of what happened, how I was created through artificial insemination, and I'm all good with it. I just have a lot of questions. The main one being, who is my biological father?" At this point, all I wanted was a name. I knew everything else would play out. And I told him, I said, I think you'd understand because, if you were in my situation, you'd probably be doing what I'm doing. And he shook his head and agreed. Called in his wife and said, "Honey, would you go downstairs into our record archives and get the file on Shorty and Betty Wyatt?" A couple minutes later, she walks in and gives it to him, carefully looks at it. I said, "All I want's a name." And he said, "Oh, here it is right here. Yes, I remember this." And he said, "Back then for confidentiality, we would invert the initials of the person that was the donor. So Weeb Crunchy was KW. That was my key to my future, was in that file." And he says, "Oh, yes, I remember this guy well. My wife and I, we were very good friends. We'd go out to dinner, became very close. Because Weeb Crunchy's wife was pregnant. That's how they got to know each other. And when Dr. Thurstein was aware that he had a lot of people that needed help getting pregnant because the Nebraska State Home for Feeble-Minded Youth in Beatrice, Nebraska, my father was not the only one that was sterilized.
There's a lot of background on that. Don't just pick it up in the middle. We have to hit Shorty Wyatt's complete story whenever you're ready, and starting back from how, you mentioned Buck v. Bell, how the Supreme Court sanctioned government ordered sterilization, and most people don't know. As far as I know, that case was never overturned. By the way, that's still legal to this day, which is probably the basis for mandatory vaccination, which has also never been overturned. I know that was in Massachusetts, and I don't know if that went to the United States Supreme Court, but forced medical procedures are on the books.
Do you see how all this is interconnected? How God has put me where I'm at to do what I'm doing. And it's not easy. So I'm just going to let you ask questions.
Okay, when you're ready. I didn't mean to interrupt you as you're on your journey of gathering information about your own birth. When you're ready, back out and cover. Shorty's first name was Herbert. Yes, Herbert Shorty
Correct.
Wyatt. When you're ready, back out and cover his story. Very interesting. Great dad to you. Yeah. Unfortunately, died young, and was I guess a workaholic, and yet I don't know that I picked up from the book that he worked himself to death. because you also said that he also had a great, very jovial attitude, happy, smiling, and yet his life filled with trauma as well. So if you want to cover Shorty's background and the forced sterilization and all that.
Yeah. Let's go to that. Like I said, Shorty could be a whole show, but this is a big part of the book. So, it's how I overcame it. Through adversity, I found out how to find strength, because many people that have gone through something like this, they wouldn't emerge from the other side. And believe me, there was many times that I thought that I wouldn't, and it's detailed in the book. So I'll back up to my father. He was born on April 16th, 1924, into a family that was very impoverished in Lincoln, Nebraska. He had 4 brothers and sisters plus himself, 5 kids. His father was an alcoholic, a womanizer, but his mother was a marvelous mother. She did her best to raise these kids under the situation that she was put in. And of course, in Lincoln, Nebraska, it was, the 30s was a Great Depression, but the 20s was not good for many poor people, impoverished people. So Shorty's dad was an alcoholic, and he discovered that if he had one less mouth to feed, that it would be more beneficial to his stash of alcohol. And of course, my father, Shorty, he liked getting out of the house. When he was 12 to 13 years old, he was kind of in the streets. He wasn't a troublemaker. He was just trying to survive. And he got in a little minor trouble, stealing some food at the grocery store so he'd have something to eat. And he was caught, and they took him home. And a week later, his father decided that he would take him and get rid of him. Instead of putting him up for adoption, they just put you in a state-run institution. And I think he was 13 years old when he entered the Beatrice State Home. And he didn't get out until 1949. So you can do the math. He was in there for a long, long time. And that's a whole nother story, how they operated. So let me collect my thoughts for a minute. I don't think of this. I don't dwell on this. And believe it or not, Shorty's dad had put his other brother, Richard, a year before in the Beatrice State Home. So there was 2 boys related, separated by a couple of years, that were incarcerated in the Beatrice State Home, just placed there. You'd give them $35. They'd fill out the paperwork. You'd get in your car and drive off. And that was it.
Anthony Fauci knows that process well. Many children have been experimented on, placed in state-sponsored homes. It is a vicious cycle where vaccine injury creates a burden upon families that they can't handle, and then they feel obligated to give their children to a state-run facility where the children are tortured and experimented upon. And it's a vicious cycle. And Anthony Fauci was intimately involved with that.
Some things never change; they get worse. But my father
was it, not to step on you, but didn't Shorty have a brother in the service that came home and tracked him down?
Yeah, his brother came home. He was in the service, and he said, "Where's my brothers?" And when he found out where they were, especially Shorty was, you could call him a runt. He was small in stature. He was uneducated. but he was a very, very light in so many people's lives. So he went down there and he said, Herbert, why are you in here? And he said, I don't really know. I got to get out of here before I go crazy.
And they let
So
him,
he
but there was a
started-
condition. They were going to let his brother take him out, but there was a condition. What was the condition?
That he be sterilized and never be able to propagate and have his so-called defective offspring. That was eugenics, population control. You have negative eugenics, such as human sterilization. The most popular one, eugenics, is abortion. And then there's some other various ones. And then on the other hand, you have positive eugenics, such as artificial insemination, how I was created. You have all sorts of ways that they promote population control. You know, embryos, implanting embryos, selective breeding, selective egg choosing. Even now, donors is a big business. Back in donor insemination is a huge business because of the internet. You can go online and you can, if you're a single mom and you want to get pregnant, you can go in and online and look at the profiles, the hair color, the IQ, the background, and you say, oh, I'd like this guy. I'd like to think of this. So they narrow it down, and then the woman will pick out who she thinks she'd like to get pregnant with through sperm donation. And some of these guys, honestly, have dozens and dozens of offspring. Some have hundreds, but there's a big difference from when it was done with me, confidentiality. Now, everything's done pretty much in the open or it's discoverable. Some donors don't want to be known, of course. And so it's a multi-situational situation that gives a lot of options.
Pardon me. By the way, the name of the lawsuit was Jacobson v. Massachusetts, 1905. And the plaintiff sued the state of Massachusetts for requiring a smallpox vaccine, Henning Jacobson. And surprise, surprise, he lost. And oh, by the way, that's 1905. Mm-hmm. And the follow-on, there's a follow-on. In 2021, the State Police Association of Massachusetts sued to block Governor Charlie Baker's executive order. Executive order. That's King Charlie Baker. He's the only authority that ordered all state employees will be vaccinated. And the courts denied the injunction, citing 1905 and Jacobson v. Massachusetts. Now, from what I'm seeing in this quick bit of research, it's centered on Massachusetts, but it is a legal precedent. So bringing us back to Shorty and what was done to him, is this some of the background that created your unprecedented exposure, public exposure, and an invite onto the Joan Rivers show?
Seems to be. But she was, let me back up a little bit with Joan Rivers. I just started going public with my story in 1991. Now, it took me 8 years to get up enough guts. And I kept all the files. I've kept files for 40 years on everything in my life, so I don't forget it. I'm going to be 71 years old, and as you know, as you get older, your mind kind of goes down a little bit. I lost my train of thought.
We were
Going
talking
deeper.
about what got you onto the Joan Rivers show.
Oh yeah. So a journalist contacted me from the London Times, and he wanted to do a story on me. And it wasn't, mainstream America was not ready for a lot of what we're talking about. They wanted to focus on my search, not what happened to Shorty. So I did that article. Lo and behold, it went, global. It was the London Times, and I started getting a lot of calls and contacts for sharing my story. And I was really taken aback. I was very humbled because I didn't think anybody would find it interesting or even be interested in knowing the truth. And I was very surprised. Joan Rivers' assistant called me and said, "This is so-and-so from the Joan Rivers show. Joan wants to have you on her show." Well, her show was brand new. I believe the year was 1991. She hadn't even done any shows yet, but she was booking them, and she booked me for her third show. And of course, I'm apprehensive. Joan Rivers is a comedian. And I really thought, is she going to get me on her show and make fun of me? I was very fearful. So they picked me up, took me to the airport in Lincoln, got on a plane, New York City. I got off the plane. I was picked up by a limo and taken to the, it was the number one place. I can't remember. It wasn't Trump Tower. It was the number one place, the best place in New York City. They took me up to my room. I believe it was on the 7th floor. And I felt like royalty. I thought maybe my story is important. So I was picked up the next day and I was taken down to the studio, spent about 20 minutes getting ready. They took me to the set. There Joan Rivers was and her dog Spike. And they introduced me and she started interviewing me. And that interview is on my website at gregwyatt.com. Like I said, I document everything. And I had that videotape for it's been 34 years ago, and I still have it. And now it's on my website. It'll never go away. That's what I do. I preserve memories.
It was a critical experience for you, building your ability to speak publicly and your character in relation to standing up for what's right and fighting injustice. You had a similar experience in school, rescuing David from bullies.
Yeah, that's a whole nother. There's so many tentacles to this octopus. It's amazing.
Well, it helped build your character.
So I was very, very pleased in the questions she asked me. It went very, very well. And I was on with Marvin Hamlish, the famous composer, and Anne Margaret, beautiful Anne Margaret. And it's like, wow, maybe I am important. Maybe my story's important. So anyway, it ended, went very well. They took me back to my hotel room. I left the next day and went back. I think at the time I was living either in Denver, Colorado, or Lincoln, Nebraska. It's a little fuzzy. And I got on with my life. And a couple days later, she sent me an autographed photo signed by her. It says, "You did great." And I thought, wow, maybe I need to tell my story more often.
Nice touch. So your mom, Betty, passionate Christian, which was important to you. She carried the family, particularly through a financial hardship. Was it 1970?
Yeah, we were always under financial hardships because of my father's situation. He could never get a job more than minimum wage, and it was always hard labor. He loved to work. I think they installed his working appreciation at the state home because that's what he did. He tended cattle and he worked the fields, and they'd work him from morning to night. It was free labor. The states loved it. It's another story. So anyway, yeah, he, even trying to, back then though, it was interesting. We were able to buy a crappy house, buy a crappy car, eat fairly cheap food like cow tongue and potatoes and hamburger. And I never had a steak in my life till I was older. But I grew to appreciate things. Whatever everything I just appreciated. And I had a very, very, very good childhood, despite the challenges. That's when, through adversity, I find strength. God was my co pilot. Betty installed Christian values in me, and I carried those, even though I deviate from them. I was a little troublemaker. I was a hellraiser, but I loved it. I loved I loved my life. I appreciated what little I had, and that was it.
Your mom and dad wanted a decent sized family, and which is impossible to do thanks to state sponsored forced sterilization. And so they tried what they could with both foster children and adoption.
Yeah, we get it fostered. And, let me say, I wanted a brother and sister so bad. I was 12 years old, and I just wanted a brother and sister. And of course, we had foster children all the time. And I learned that I didn't want to get close to them because they'd leave and I'd be abandoned. The relationship would end. So I just kind of detached from that situation, but that didn't slow my mother down. And then one day, my mother was watching the news in the morning, the local news in Lincoln, Nebraska. They talked about this adoption program, Hold Adoption Agency. And let me back up. My parents tried to adopt white children, and they were turned down because they knew my dad's background. However, they said if we wanted to adopt interracial children outside of the United States, that's a different story. So my mom contacted Hold Adoption Agency, and a year later, I had a little sister. And I remember when my mom said, Greg, how would you like a sister? I said, I love it. And she says, well, we have to go across the world to get them, her. And she says, they're not going to look like you and me. They come from Korea. They have brown skin and slanted eyes. And I remember what I said to my mom very distinctively. I said, Mom, God loves all children, and so do I. Never forget that. It didn't matter. It didn't matter the color. It didn't matter the race. I just wanted a family. I wanted our family to enlarge. I wanted my mother to be happy. Of course, my father was he was for it, but he was working 60, 70 hours a week. He'd come home exhausted. But I will say this too, over the next 20 years, he loved those girls as much as he did me. It didn't matter to him either. Sorry. I've done a pretty good job keeping it together.
Well, God bless him.
And it's
God bless him. I don't know what was the disqualification in Shorty's background that kept him from being allowed to adopt a Caucasian child. That he was institutionalized. Did he have an IQ score that they didn't like? There was a minimum. What disqualified Shorty from having a Caucasian?
Being in a crazy insane asylum. They didn't feel that, just like
Well, that's fascinating. How did he get committed simply by being caught stealing food?
Well, this was normal. There was over 200 of these institutions throughout the United States. And if you had a kid that you didn't like, that was giving you trouble, wasn't minding you, you'd get in the car, they'd take him down to the institution, pay $35 and be done with them forever.
The mental institution horror stories have a lot of legitimacy to them, don't they? Basically disappeared. And
over, if you dig deep, and again, most people don't have time to do it. They don't have the interest to do it. But of course I did, because it's part of my lineage. And I keep, even now, uncovering stories much, much worse than my father's.
Deeply disturbing. Deeply disturbing.
Yeah. And I learned from these stories. There was one place down in Florida. You can make a note of it sometime. It escapes me now. I found it a week ago, and I was able to connect what went on there with probably what happened to my father. And the correlation, there was, really severe institutions where torture was normal. I mean, you would not believe what they did to these kids. This was in Florida. I can't remember the name. I wish I could. I could do a whole show on that. But I started being able to see that maybe my father was the lucky one. He ended up in a fairly decent institution, a fairly decent crazy house. And he was able to get out, but he had to be sterilized.
A series of centers called the Chrome Centers, Krome. Does that sound familiar? The Alligator Alcatraz Chrome Centers?
Nah, never heard of it. It's in Florida. We'll move on from that. But I learned a lot, by looking at things that were in common. But my father he was in one of the better ones. It was, of course, Beatrice State Home for Feeble-Minded Youth. Beatrice loved it because they got free labor. He worked, this was during World War II. So they had a lot of munitions contracts in that city. And they made a lot of money off free labor and never paid him anything, because they says, well, you're getting room and board, so you need to work. And they'd work him 10, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. With Sundays, they were off. And that's if he wasn't working in the fields and working with the cattle. And so I'll tell you something. My mother, when she told me, this was in 83, I never told my father he was still alive. I never told Shorty. I knew the truth. I never even thought of it. It wasn't an option. But when I'd look at him, I had such a deep appreciation for the man he was. This broken old man that had had a couple heart attacks, still happy, still so loving, but I never could bring myself to tell him I knew the truth, nor ask him questions about the Beatrice State Home. That would have been cruel. And God placed this situation to roll out in 1983, because on Thanksgiving Day, about 6 months after I found out, on June 8th, 1983, On Thanksgiving Day, 1983, he had a heart attack and he passed away. And he was released at the age of 59. That's the end of that.
Well, certainly working himself to death is not out of the question given his lifestyle of what he endured. Let's move on to your next experiences. You write, in 2005, I experienced my first significant exposure to toxic mold. And then as a result of a genomic detoxification test, found out my body wasn't designed to process mold toxins, heavy metals, and environmental chemicals the way most people's could. I beg to differ, my friend. I would say toxic mold, heavy metals, and environmental chemicals are difficult for any human being to pass. But you had a little bit more difficulty than most.
Especially for me. When I had a real estate company in 2004, and I was extremely successful. We had 20 homes in escrow at all time, Prescott, Arizona. I had a staff of agents. I was a marketing genius. I really was, not tooting my horn. I acted a program to get leads online. This was early internet. I was way ahead. I was doing what Zillow's doing now, lead generation. And so I started up my own company. I didn't want to work for somebody else. And I found a broker and I get these leads, and I would be getting leads, 100 leads a week from people wanting to move to beautiful Prescott, Arizona. And I would give them out to a half a dozen agents and they'd run with it. And I'd take 50% of their commission. And they were very happy because they wouldn't have had any business. I rented this building and it was a pretty good deal. It was all rehabbed and it didn't rain for 6 months. It was a dry period. And then it started raining. And it rained a week. It rained a couple more weeks. And I noticed spots on the ceiling. And then I needed buckets underneath. And then a month later, there was this horrible smell. And I didn't know anything about mold. And I was just, I had a booming business. I wanted to franchise it so I could leave money to Weston and Emily. That's a whole nother story. Why my success is driven by making money for the benefit of my kids when I'm not here. So anyway, they did an emergency move out. They said, you got to get out. So what happened was this rich doctor bought this building and he just taped over it, filled in the holes, and it was not safe. It started leaking and leaking, and they told us we had to move out. So I moved out. They moved my whole office out down the street to a crappy location. And then about, 6 months later, I started feeling sick. Long story short, all my agents, not one of them got sick like I got sick. And it was so debilitating. It was the worst. And of course, nobody knew about mold back then. Richie Schumacher, who is the expert at it, now he's retired. He was the only one, and you had to go down to Texas. And of course, you didn't have the internet. So I did the best I could, but it took me a good 6 years to let it work out of my system. And it was horrible. I couldn't walk down the hallway without balancing myself, grabbing onto furniture. And you can look it up. You can do the dangers of toxic mold. But back to I went to my doctor. He said, I think there's something else going on, why you get sick over this stuff. And he did this detoxigenomic profile, which I still have. And it shows that the genes from my mother, of course, it combines with the father to make you who you are. Some of them were not compatible, which I found interesting. Here they went through all this problem, and now I got defective genes. And people can debate all this stuff. I'm not interested in debating. That's not, but it was true. It's true. I have a distinctive inability that prevents me from detoxification process. And I still have it today, but particularly mold, I'm very unsuccessful against battling that out. And so I got better, and then I got re-exposed 4 years after I got better, and I got sick again, but I knew how to detoxify better because, the internet was there and supplements and all this. But that took another 3 years. So during this course of this journey, I was chronically ill with mold poisoning. And then again, lo and behold, a year ago, about right now, I started feeling bad in this house that I'm at. When I'd go to the kitchen and stand at the sink, my legs would go numb, I get brain fog, and I thought, oh my God, I had a friend come over and he pulled the dishwasher out, and I got pictures of it, black mold. But it was very mild because it was drip, 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 the dishwasher. When you turn it on, it would drip. And we didn't use the dishwasher that much. So it probably had been going on for many years. I had them remediated. I did the testing, and I couldn't stay in my house anymore. And I've done this before. It's called mold avoidance. So I had to live in my office downtown because it was clean and escape the mold. Because the first thing is when if you have mold toxicity, if you have mold illness, the first thing you have to do is get out of the mold. You can detoxify all you want, but as long as you're in the mold, you'll never get better. So that's in my book too. And so a year later, it took me probably about 6 months to get rid of that, less and less as I get smarter and smarter. We remediated the house, that one little area caused all the problems. The house is totally clean now, doesn't bother me whatsoever. I don't have to live in another place. I can be at home with my family, but it's gone and I'm alive. At 71 years old, a lot of people suffer irreversible brain damage, premature Alzheimer's, cancer. You can look it up, the dangers of mold illness.
So it's naturally occurring, as is so typically the case. It's simply in the wrong place. There's a prevalence of these molds that have very specific jobs, such as decaying plant matter, that find their place in homes, particularly apparently in the 70s, as homes became more efficient and less capable of circulating things out, where these molds gathered in low light and high moisture, and they're seeking to do a very specific job of breaking down plant material, but as is so often the case.
Now let me correct you a little bit. Building materials, they thrive on building materials. Carpets, drywall, stuff that you find in a home. It's just the same as plant material. They thrive on it. Molds are insidious. If you look up in the Bible, it talks about the mold. And it says you should just burn your house down to escape it. It is demonic. It is not good. And I'll add something else too through my research. 80% of homes, 80% of commercial properties have had water intrusion that was not remediated properly. So the thing is, a lot of people, many people can go in these homes and it's full of black mold, doesn't affect them at all. Other people can go into a home that has 2% black mold and they'll die from it. It goes back to that deoxygenomic profile. What are your genes? What do they say? Are they super strong for detoxification? If so, you'll detoxify yourself right out of it and not have a problem. But if you're like me and many other people, and let me add this, Gio, there are dozens and dozens of great groups on Facebook that you can do your own independent research, and you will be amazed at the hundreds of thousands of people that are suffering and running and losing everything from the same situation I survived so far.
You can say the same thing about a whole host of dangers to human health, to
Absolutely.
include electromagnetic sensitivity across the board. The vast majority of them are absolutely thoroughly ignored by the Rockefeller death cult medical industry. Let's move on as time's going on. I haven't even gotten to the next level that you and Joyce found yourselves reliving the same issues that your parents did and the ability to have your own children.
Interesting, isn't it? History repeats itself. I really believe that. Yeah, we got married and it was amazing. Joyce is just an amazing woman. And we wanted to have a family. And we moved to Prescott, Arizona from Columbus, Nebraska. We sold our business there. We could move wherever we wanted to. And we moved to wonderful Prescott, best place in the United States. Settled down to have a family, bought a house, and made our plans. Of course, couldn't get pregnant. And we kind of had an idea that one of us had some infertility issues. So we went back to Denver, Colorado, where I lived for 15 years. And we found the best fertility doctor, best place in the United States, and tried in vitro fertilization. Very expensive, even back then. This was 1996, 1997. We were married for a year or two, maybe not even that long. We wanted to get right on it because we were getting old parents, we weren't young. And we tried it. We flew back. We're making all the plans. We got the call. It didn't work. It was like a death. More pain, more sorrow, so what are we going to do? Are we going to live in the problem, or are we going to try to create another solution? Try it again. We tried it again. The results were the same, and it was evident that it wasn't going to work. So with my adoption background, and Joyce's father was adopted, by the way, we decided that we were going to try to adopt. And by the way, this is all detailed in my book. It's an amazing book. And so we found an attorney, downtown Phoenix, went and seen him, filled out the paperwork, and took it in. And he says, well, good news and bad news. Good news, I help a lot of people. The bad news is I've got only about 200 people on file, and I only get maybe 10 or 20 done a year. So don't get your hopes up. Well, I've heard that before. But being a master marketer and salesman, I noticed he said, make yourself a profile that describes you and your wife, who you are, where you came from, what your vision is, and why a woman, mother, should pick you. Well, it took only less than a month, and we got a call. We'd been chosen. Wow. But there was one caveat. This young girl named Cassandra, wonderful, beautiful, young Hispanic girl, 16 years old. The birth father's name was Alex. He was 17 years old. They were Catholic. They didn't believe in abortion, so they sought out this attorney and went on the file. So there was another family that was interested, a very wealthy family, it sounded like. But there was one caveat. They only wanted a girl. And if it was a boy, they didn't want it. And we take either. That made her decide that we were the couple that she was going to choose. After we got the information, we kind of got fairly close to know. We wanted to know them, and we wanted them to know us. Again, it's all in the book. That's why I wrote the book, so I don't have to relive this every day. It's interesting, but it's not something I want to do for the rest of my life.
I got you. These are very difficult experiences, but we're writing the book and promoting the book for a good reason, not the least of which is the follow-on experiences of what you went through with the medical industrial complex and what happened to Weston. As a matter of fact, the next couple of sections I really feel strongly need to be read verbatim, so you don't have to do anything. Just wait until I finish sharing this with the audience and see what your reaction is. Starting pages 75 through 76 and then page 79. The guidance we received from medical professionals in relation to Weston seems straightforward. A few essential vaccinations were needed, such as hepatitis B and vitamin K shots. However, within hours, we encountered a shadow of concern as jaundice crept into Weston's life. The recommendation for circumcision followed soon after. We sought to do what was best for our child, trusting the guidance provided in that moment. Little did we know Weston's 2-month well baby visit would be a turning point. Despite our hesitations, we felt a pressure from a doctor whose demeanor, while friendly, belittled our concerns regarding vaccinations. Each subsequent visit led us down a path of further uncertainty as Weston experienced illnesses that were dismissed as normal occurrences, and they prescribed both antibiotics, Tylenol, and Motrin. They were given around the clock. Just a normal day for a newborn, they claimed. There's something sinister about the timing of these, quote, well baby shots. The changes after the 2 and 4 month visits were slow and small at first, so small that you hardly noticed them. One less coo, a little blank look, a softer laugh. That's the cruel part, because the regressions creep in quietly during the same weeks every infant is expecting to change. They're easy to dismiss as, quote, normal development. For us, these tiny shifts add up fast, and by the time we realized something was wrong, the pattern was already set. By the way, I mention this very frequently as I'm talking about the Borgia family and what it means to be an expert assassin, what it means to actually poison someone. The most devious assassins are the ones who have modified the dosage so that by the time their victim falls, they are long gone. That's the essence of expert assassination, and you could very well make the case that's what's going on with vaccination, especially if you have both the medical profession and the pharmaceutical profession aware of these effects. As time unfolded, it became clear our beloved Weston was suffering from consequences of those early decisions. It became evident that each round of vaccinations had slowly turned him into a casualty of vaccine-related injury. Through the haze of new parenthood, we gradually recognized the toll vaccinations had taken on his health, spiraling him into a struggle that altered the sacred life created by God. Those precious moments of joy seemed so distant as we faced the complexities of his condition. Yet the changes were subtle and hard to identify, particularly for 2 inexperienced parents who were completely captivated by their newborn. Weston's once joyful and healthy spirit quickly faded, giving way to ongoing illness and an increasing number of doctor visits. Over a year later, Dr. Mick reached out, suggesting the MMR vaccine. Fast forward to today, Weston as an adult, yet he is an adult, yet he resides in a body that operates at the level of a 3 to 4-year-old. His life, a precious creation of God, has been disrupted, irrevocably changed by the harmful effects of vaccination and insidious satanic ritual. And this small paragraph that I included from page 79, there was no one to walk us through the questions or the quiet doubts. The doctor insisted it wasn't the vaccines. So we followed what we were told. It wasn't until after Emily's second round of shots that the dots started to join. Weston's decline never hit like a thunderclap. It was more like a balloon leaking air, the life and balance slipping away little by little until there was nothing left of the way he'd been. And yet you, and especially Joyce, put it all together and were repeatedly dismissed as not knowing what you're talking about. You're just the parents.
With that statement you made, I want to make everybody aware that I am writing a 5-book series based upon Weston and Emily, what happened to them from the observations of a father. There's never been books written like this, ever. It's a big hole in the whole literary establishment. And these books, it's a 5-book series. And the first one is called When His Smile Disappeared. And what this is an autism regression memoir of illness, love, and a father's fight for hope. And it goes on and on. There'll be more on my website about this. We're releasing the first book in about 30 days also. I have a lot of things going on. I formed my own publishing company, and I'm working on a lot of good stuff. And I'm going to get these books out this year, and then I might retire. I don't know. But this 5-book, we call it the Wyatt Family Series, and there's 5 different books, and we're rolling them out individually. But this book, When His Smile Disappeared, it goes into deep information about what exactly happened, what we went through, what we experienced it from a father's viewpoint. Because let me say this, fathers, there's all sorts of moms out there, but where are the dads? And I address this in this series. There are no fathers out there as vocal as Greg Wyatt. The Lord has led me down this path to write these books, to communicate these feelings and feel a need that doesn't exist. So with that being said, I'll end.
Well, Greg,
that story.
This is a war. This is a war being waged by the power of coercive government. There is a massive corrupt system that runs from the medical industry through the pharmaceutical industry and used with the power of government to force these crimes upon the average person, to horribly debilitate you and anything you love, your pets, your children, yourself. And basically, when it comes to children, people don't even realize that they have choices, and in many cases, they seem they don't. They are told that they will harm their children. And oh, by the way, if you're able to piece all this together, we will get to this later. If you're able to piece all this together, this cabal of criminals is protected by the government. You have no recourse. The government's not going to go after the criminals. The government is criminal. And if you try to go after them, you have no recourse either. You end up fighting yourself, the taxpayer. We'll get into that later. I want to include this next section. The Weston's birth parents were so taken with you and Joyce that they shocked you when they got pregnant again, being silly young Catholics, and said, we're pregnant again, and you need to be the parents of this little girl, Emily. And you acquiesced. And shockingly, you ended up reliving the same nightmare. I want to read this section here from pages 81 83. In relation to Emily, then came the 2-month visit. The same sterile room, the same tray of needles, the same rehearsed reassurances from the white coats. I love those words, those phrases, by the way. The needle piercing her leg, she cried, but otherwise seemed mostly normal. When she finally drifted into sleep, it was a bit restless, but by morning, something in her eyes had changed. It was subtle but unmistakable. The brightness, the spark, the way she used to lock on our gaze was dulled, as though a curtain had been pulled between her and the world. At first, the changes were quiet. She smiled less. Her coos grew faint. She seemed unsettled, less interested in the faces and voices that had once captivated her. Joyce noticed it immediately. Mothers always do. She's not the same, she whispered, her voice tight with fear. The doctors, again, dismissed us, just as they had Weston, quoting, "Babies develop at different rates. Don't compare her to other children. She'll catch up." But we knew better. We had seen this before. The 4-month visit brought more needles. She screamed again, but afterwards she seemed to bounce back. For a short while, she looked healthy, still smiling, still reaching for us. But we had already lived through this with Weston. We weren't blind anymore. We knew there was something terribly wrong, even if the doctors refused to help us see it. Instead of listening, they made it sound like the problem could have been us, our parenting, our perception, our overprotective. How about that? You're overprotective of your children. But it wasn't us. You're not letting us poison your kids. It's overprotective. It was the shots. The pattern was too clear to ignore. Are you saying there's a link between vaccination and autism? That's ridiculous. So after Emily's 4-month vaccines, we drew a line. We told the doctor we just wanted to hold off and that we weren't comfortable with moving forward. Well, he didn't like that. He expressed his dissatisfaction in tone that we had known all too well, condescending, dismissive, as though we were reckless parents for simply protecting our child from their toxins. We stood firm. We had seen enough.
Horrible. He had the audacity to say, he said this several times, he says, "You mean to tell me that this young couple entrusted you to these children and you want to subject them to sickness and death?" And I said, "No, sir. No way. You're the expert here." And I firmly believe that he was. You got to remember, my first experience with a doctor was Dr. Robert Thurstein, the most noble, wonderful, honorable physician that I'd ever met. And back then in the 50s and 60s, things were different with doctors. They'd make house calls. They'd care about their patients. There was none of this online stuff going on where you're just a number and ink on a prescription pad. Things have changed 180 degrees. And as time went on, I started changing too, by waking up even more to the realities of this medical community. Sure, I'd woken up to the realities in a whole lot of stuff throughout my life, but this was personal.
I love the gaslighting. I love the gaslighting. You're the parent. You love your children, and yet they assume, they act as if they know more than you, know better than you, love your children better than you. Meanwhile, you're watching the effect of disease, of intoxication. And you're saying, well, wait a minute. We're the ones that now have to deal with the after effects of you poisoning our kids. And you have the nerve to gaslight us and make it sound like we're reckless, we're lazy, we don't know what we're doing. Meanwhile, we're watching our children slip away. Absolutely unconscionable. Like I said earlier, Greg, this is a war. This is a war. And the power of government, the power of the medical industry. Do you have any choices, by the way? Are there holistic clinics that we can go to have our children at, and they're readily available? They compete with these? No. It's all under the power of coercive government and their licensing game. And your choices are basically none. You have no choice. I mentioned my note to myself, doctors. Now, are these doctors proceeding from their own personal experience of having healed children, of having watched the effects, or they are proceeding from their own indoctrination. The root word docere having to do with learning and studying and has nothing to do with healing, by the way, Latin. Learning from textbooks. And certainly those textbooks, if it's written in a textbook, then we can trust that. As opposed to what a healer used to do, prove themselves by healing. That's not what's done, especially through the licensing gamut of the government. Let's see, worse, those are at least the questions. Let's see here. Oh, and of course, in relation to the expertise, you mentioned this in this next section, the white coats. Once you put on that white lab coat, drape the stethoscope around your neck, you pick up the clipboard or now the tablet, you become a god. You are incapable of having your own agenda. You are incapable of seeking your own wealth and aggrandizement, of doing or saying anything wrong that has anything to do that's outside of the best interest of myself or anyone I love. This is part of a culture that includes giving doctors the honorific of doctor. No other profession, very few other professions. Oh, who are you? You're Greg Wyatt. I'm in real estate. Hey, Johnny Cerrucci, veteran, journalist. Oh, who are you? You're Dr. Spock. We put that honorific, and as soon as you hear that honorific, it's mind control. It triggers you to stop and elevate the individual. This individual is a hero. They don't do anything that is in their own interest. That everything they do is because they love you, just like the government loved you. Anthony Fauci loves you. CNN loves you. Anyway, the next section is very telling in relation to this. You discuss the different development paths for Weston and Emily, your personal experiences there. Chapter 26, the fallibility of the white coats. A small section that I'd also like to read again. Not again, but also like to read. The doctor smiled the way doctors do, confident, polished, reassuring, clipboard in hand, stethoscope slung like a badge. What did I just say? We nodded when he said safe. We nodded when he said routine. We nodded because we were taught a white coat meant wisdom and protection. We didn't know that behind that assurance was a pharmaceutical pipeline of protocol that standard could permanently alter our child, and the blind trust could break a family's heart. They called it informed consent. Again, oxymoron gaslighting. But the only thing we were informed of was the schedule, not the science. Dates to hit, boxes to check. We weren't told about the conflicts of interest, how the doctor's recommendations followed guidelines written by committees funded by the very companies that profit from those guidelines. We weren't told that in the rare events something went wrong, we wouldn't even be able to sue them in a court of law. Oh, by the way, those are the same committees that wrote the 1984 Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, 84, 86, right? Same committees. Cabal.
Let me interject this. Weston was one of the first 5,000 test cases in the omnibus proceedings in the early 2000s. We submitted all of his records. It is such a litany of proof. And I kept, like I said, I'm a records hound. We put it together. I'm looking at it right there. It's this thick, his medical records, documenting his illnesses, his shots, and everything else that was important. We sent it to them in 2004, and it took 7 years for them to send it back with a letter of denial. That's when my life really shifted with the reality of what happened to Weston and Emily and the reality of how this medical mafia works. And it's all for one reason. You know, yeah, it's partially eugenics, population control, absolutely. But there's a lot of money in this. It's like organized crime. It's medical organized crime. 100%. If you look at the correlation between organized crime back in the, 100 years ago and how it operated and the money they made and the fun they had doing what they were doing, killing people, controlling people, it's the exact same thing.
No, it's worse, Greg, because they have no one bigger than them. At least organized crime had other bosses and the fraud of the government that they were somewhat afraid of. Here, the highest authority are the criminals. When the government commits a crime, who can you rely upon to make it right? The government. The government will police itself. The government will have what? A committee, a congressional roundtable. It'll examine. It'll wring its hands. Who?
Same thing, Gio. Same thing.
Who holds the government accountable?
No one.
No one. And this began your journey of exposing corruption. Page 91.
Absolutely.
This was the day my trust in the white coat died. Once you see behind the curtain, you cannot unsee it. What began as a search for answers, by the way, the pandemic was this for many people. What began as a search for answers became a mission to tell truth. Oh, in relation to what you just said, let me highlight and underline what you just said. No industry, Greg, no industry has zero liability. No industry is entirely protected by the government. Ludicrous lawsuits that the gun company Remington was somehow responsible for the supposed mass shooting at Sandy Hook. Supposedly Remington paid thousands of dollars to the families of Sandy Hook, as opposed to the pharmaceutical industry that has blanket protection to do whatever it wants. This is the day that my trust in the white lab coat died. Once you see behind the curtain, you cannot unsee it. What began as a search for answers became a mission to tell the truth we were living and to refuse, tell the truth of what we were living and to refuse to ever be silent again. A mission to follow the money, expose the machinery, and drag the truth into the light, no matter how many white coats tried to stand in the way. Weston's vaccine injury and degradation devastated both you and Joyce. Again, quoting from you, his body was racked with chronic diarrhea. His nights were filled with pain he could not express except by crying until his throat was raw. He began head banging against walls and floors, his little body thrashing in frustration. Clearly, you didn't love your son enough to let these doctors do whatever they wanted to. Toe walking became his gait, a strange, stiff rhythm that screamed of neurological injury. Clearly, you just didn't love your children enough. You should have just blindly continued to trust when the doctors required that you fill your children with toxins. Absolutely gatekeeping. Institutional robbery, injury, and death of you and what you love. Across the board, children, pets, no one dares question. God forbid that you try to look up vaccine injury on the internet. This is the power. Now, Greg, when you have blanket liability and you have nothing but profits, by the way, this is why Bill Gates, the techno geek, is suddenly an expert in vaccination. What is he an expert in vaccination for? Well, he told, I think it was CNBC or MSNBC, that when he donates $1 million to a pharmaceutical industry, to the company, he gets a $20 million return. How is that? Well, that's because there's no liability. When that industry has billions and billions to play with, this is the result. They own information. They dominate information. And they expunge anything negative about what they do from any of your sources. This is what's dangerous and why what you do is so important. One of the richest questions about this is, by the way, this is also why both doctors and lawyers have so much time and money. They are richly rewarded for their roles in this corrupt organized crime that they can go and buy themselves into politics. There's a reason why political figures are dominated by the professions of doctor and lawyer. And they can go ahead and feed it, keep it going. They do so well for themselves. They have copious excesses of time and money, buy themselves into politics. They're welcomed by a system of malignancy and corruption. This is what you mentioned earlier, of purposeful genocide. And I don't think it's really okay. So it's not so much that particular ethnicity being targeted or particular groups are being targeted. We're all being targeted, and the malignancy. I submit to you, and I think Greg agrees with me on this. They know this is going on. They know this is going on, and they have a vested interest to keep us in the dark and keep it going because they fear and hate us. They want us debilitated. They want us handicapped. They want us burdened. They want to continue to rob us, poison us, and handicap, rob, and poison, and do that to all that we love, to give us that extra burden. Maybe I'm being too cynical, Greg. Am I being too cynical by saying the system fully knows and understands what it's doing?
Not at all. No. You epitomize the whole situation. Not only the way that I have presented it in this book, but with the reality of what's going on. One of the things I want to point out too is they can erase me, but they will never be able to silence me. That's why I write these books, because they can erase me, which if they do, whatever. But they cannot ever silence Greg Wyatt. I've paid for the hosting of my website for 10 years. If I was gone tomorrow, that website's going to be there forever. And that website is gregwyatt.com, is one of my proudest accomplishments, not only to have lived through this, but to have documented. It's so important. It is so very important that you give me the time in your life to share my expertise with you, so you will not make the same mistakes that you have. And if you have, you will realize it now. And it's not going to be easy, but it's better to live in a state of truth than a state of denial.
We're at the 90-minute mark. I want to go a little bit further, and then we'll break for the next iteration as we get into the heat of your battle. You were basically gaslit by the white lab coats, and you say as much in the book. We told the doctors, we begged them to see what we saw, but again came the rehearsed lines, boys talk later, don't compare him to others, he'll grow out of it. Meanwhile, our son screamed through the nights, losing words, losing health, losing himself. Each scheduled vaccination coincided with another measurable loss. They told us we were imagining it, but we weren't imagining it, we were living it. Joyce kept you both going. Weston's degradation in speech and motor skills were excruciating to experience as parents. And I love that, in fact, I'm going to say what the name of this section is. Section 9, Medical Betrayal. Chapter 29, The Dismissal of a Mother's Intuition. If the unraveling broke our hearts, the dismissal broke our spirits. It wasn't just that Weston was losing words, joy, and connection. It was that every time we reached out for help, the very people we trusted with his life waved it away as if we were imagining things. We trust the government to love us and protect us. We trust doctors to heal us. We trust the media to find the truth for us. Betrayed by all of the above at each and every step. We weren't naive. As parents, we watched Weston smile, talk, clap, and meet milestones. We had watched with sinking hearts as all of it faded after the routine shots of his 2, 4, and 6-month well visits, inversely named. I think they get the same convention from naming legislation. Whatever you need to know what piece of legislation is, you take what its name is and completely invert it, and that will tell you what the law is. We saw the difference. We lived it. We knew. But when we brought our fears to the white coats, we were told he was probably born that way. Oh, boys talk later than girls. It's just autism. Vaccines don't do that. Each word cut like a knife. Not only were we grieving in the loss of our healthy, thriving child, but we were told our grief was baseless, our memories faulty, and our instincts irrelevant. The very system.
Let me mention this too. The white coats have convinced millions of parents that their children's autism wasn't caused by the 20, 30, 40 vaccinations, but it's genetic. They have the money. That's the big thing. They just came out with an autistic Barbie. They're making everything mainstream to get people to back off and accept it. There's a reason why moms think this way, and I'm going to explain it. It was like a phenomenon I couldn't figure out 10 years ago, is that parents, when I tell them Weston and Emily's story, they would kind of dismiss it because of this reason. They don't want to feel responsible for their kids' autism, that they could have been responsible for it by giving them these dozens of worthless shots, that it was more accomplished by the bad luck of a draw. That's what I blame it on. That's what they blame it on. They don't blame it on the shots. They blame it on genetics. And that's the big push now within all these groups and all these people, mainstreaming autistic people, making them into a blessing. Autism is a blessing.
No, it's a crime, Greg. It's not a blessing. It's a crime.
Yeah.
Conducted by the very system that we trust to do the complete inverse. Netflix also normalizing in order to dismiss vaccine injury with 2 separate series, Love on the Spectrum and Down for Love, completely ignoring the source of Down syndrome and autism and just focusing on the compassion and the empathy and the love, but not necessarily the burden, and definitely not the cause.
Well, let me just kind of close with this, is that I just want to point out where this has gotten Weston and Emily. Today, Weston turns 28 years old on Groundhog's Day. He was born February 2nd, 1998. He functions at the level of a 3 to 4-year-old. He's totally disabled. He lives in a wonderful group home, community home, with 4 other severe to profound autistics that need 24-hour a day care. And most of them are all in their 20s now. I seen this coming. I seen it happening 15 years ago when I became part of the anti-vaccine movement, which we won't get into, not knowing that it was a safer vaccine movement. Now, on my daughter, Emily, Weston's full biological sister, same parents, same situation, but we cut them off early. And now Emily is 26 years old, and she functions at the level of an 8-year-old. Both my kids will never live independently. They will never drive a car. They will never hold a job. They will never get married. They will never have a life that God meant to be. And me as a father, What does it cost me? I'll never drive a car with Weston. I won't play baseball with them. I won't throw frisbee with them. I will never have an intimate father-son relationship based on who I am to make a difference in his life. He's just spinning out there in the world of vaccine injury. But I will say this, both of my kids, because of Joyce and myself, are the most loving, caring individuals that you would ever meet. They are very special. They are very kind. They are very emotional. And they're human beings that were just damaged by these evil, toxic shots. And we go on.
A system of criminal corruption, a system of mandatory criminal corruption, malignant. It's a war. It's a war on us and everything that we love. Greg, appreciate you.
Yeah. And we could go on, and that's why we're breaking it up in
We're going to pause here. We're going to multi-part series, and we'll see how much we can get through on the next one. And stay tuned for the next installment.
Thank you, sir.
Appreciate you, Greg. We'll talk to you offline in just a second.
Okay, bye.